Hello and welcome to Final Girls 101. My name is Anthony and I am joined here today with an expert in the field of horror and Final Girls, Grady Hendrix. Grady
Hey,
Oh, I'm sorry. Hello, Grady.
yep.
I was just going to say Grady Hendrix is the author of Horror Store, the author of My Best Friend's Exorcism, We Told Our Souls. Well, that's last year's Southern Book Club's Guide to Slaying Vampires, and also Paperbacks from Hell, which is an encyclopedia of the horror paperbacks that came out in the 80s and 90s, the horror paperback boom, as they call it. And in this book, he reads all of the books he can get his hands on, so you don't have to. But he finds good ones along the way, and we are grateful for them. A lot of them have been, well, the good ones have been reprinted by such presses as Valancourt, and they're worth checking out. Grady is most recently the author of Final Girl Support Group, which came out just last month, or no, earlier this month.
Earlier this month, yeah.
We're a day away from being last month. So I think that is a perfect lead into the question that's going to start off Final Girls 101, which is, what is a final girl? And I'd like to start first with the definition Grady has at the start of his most recent novel, which I will then ask him to take away from there. So it is very simply and succinctly, final girl, noun, the last and sole survivor of a horror movie. So Grady, tell us about this definition.
So, I mean, there's all kinds of ways to define a final girl. I think by now it's pretty divorced from horror movie solely. I think it's a term that's kind of entered the pop culture mainstream consciousness. And we all know it's the woman who survives a horror movie. There's the occasional dude, like Nightmare on Elm Street 2. I think the actor Mark Gatiss is a final guy. Those are pretty rare. Usually it's a girl, and it's usually a slasher movie. I mean, two men survive Jaws, but Jaws isn't a slasher movie. It is a horror movie. I just didn't want to get too hung up on that with the book. But so the term was sort of first coined by Carol Clover in 1992 in her book Men, Women, and Chainsaws, which is sort of a feminist look at horror movies, specifically slasher movies. And Carol Clover's take on it is very much based on the slashers of the late 70s, early 80s, sort of that golden age between 78 and 84, when like 150 slashers hit the big screen. The original Nightmare on Elm Street, Friday the 13th, Halloween, Toolbox Murders, The Dorm That Dripped Blood, all those. Her thing was, it's the woman who survives a horror movie, often kills the killer or gets away from him. And then she had a bunch of stuff that was sort of a gendered read on it, saying, it's often, if you look at something like Laurie Strode, played by Jamie Lee Curtis in Halloween, often has an androgynous look, is sort of asexual. She's the good girl, the one who doesn't go out and have sex and everything. But that doesn't really hold up so much. I mean, one of the first slasher feature film is Black Christmas from 1974. And in that, Olivia Hussey, who has A+ sweater game, she's pregnant. And is actually, it seems like the killer's targeted her because it's her boyfriend who's angry she's going to get an abortion. So really, ever since the beginning, that sort of the final girl has to be a virgin thing has not existed. And I feel like Dr. Clover's sort of definition is a little too focused on a gendered reading. To me, a few things have to happen with the final girl. It's a girl who survives a horror movie. She kills the killer or somehow gets away from him and incapacitates him. And often, I guess, to me, the big thing with her is that she doesn't get away from the killer because she's stronger or a better fighter or smarter or somehow has some natural advantage. She usually gets away simply because she doesn't give up. She just keeps going, even beyond the point where a normal human being would be like, you know what, tap me out. I've had a day. Like, I've gone out a second-story window. I've been chased with a chainsaw. I've run through these bushes. I've seen my friend hung on a meat hook. I've been shoved into like a cooler. I've been beaten up. I've been slashed with knives. I've been tied to. I'm done. I'm out. Like, enough. So yeah, for the purposes of the book, a girl who survives a horror movie, who gets the better of the killer and gets there by not giving up.
No, and I think that that's an interesting distinction, is that you do have to discuss the idea of the gendered language, and especially with the early ones where, it can be read into them some degree, which, leads me to, I think, an interesting point about what you were just saying in terms of the idea of why the final girl is the one who survives, not because she's a BA, but in fact because she survives. And, I was thinking about some of these earliest ones, the hallmarks of the slasher franchises, where you have Halloween and, say, Friday the 13th, which, Halloween she gets targeted most likely because she looks like his sister and is in front of the house. And it's just sort of this, something that's also you lose in the sequels to those movies is that the first Halloween, which I rewatched last year, is that, Mike Myers is like a sex killer in it. Like that's, when you're seeing his point of view, he's heavy breathing. It's very, it's on the nose when you really look at it. So there is this play on the idea of, she's female and innocent and therefore a target. And then you have something like Friday the 13th, which, she's the innocent one. What's her name? Jenny. And then you have this weird moment at the end, which is completely contrived that it would happen just to add drama, is that the killer reveals herself to Jenny before she tries to kill her, which she doesn't do for anyone else, which, could just serve as a purpose of the viewer letting them know, but here's the master plan. But there's also this idea that it's interesting because she's innocent, it's almost like she tries to have a actual conversation with her, but still has to fulfill ultimately what a killer is. And I guess to me, not only this all builds to is there has to be this idea of a final girl that she can't exist if there's not the slasher. And it doesn't necessarily have to be the male gaze of the slasher in that terms. It's just like that they function in two roles where like one can't exist without the other. So
right. Yeah, but I mean that's like, yeah. That's how you get drama, right? Like a movie just about cops is less interesting than a movie about cops and robbers. A romantic comedy, like where it's just one person, is not very interesting. So yeah, one necessitates the other, but that goes all the way back, right? I mean, that's Little Red Riding Hood. Without the wolf, it's just a long walk to grandma's house with a bunch of shit, like in a basket, like maybe it's a pain in the butt to do, and it's a long hike, but there's not much inherently interesting there,
Mm-hmm. Well, I mentioned that because what I think is interesting about your newest novel is that while there are definitely inescapably meta moments, you walk a fine balance of trying to like be a little bit more subtle with it. And I do feel like there is this attention, the characters, to sum this up for people who haven't read it yet very succinctly. This reality of this novel is that the franchises that we all know, such as Halloween, Texas Chainsaw Massacre, etc., are more or less adaptations of true crime stories.
Yeah.
And this is a world where, things like this just happen. There are some times where a woman has been attacked by a killer, managed to get out on top of it, and then this person comes back somehow, sometimes in ways that, don't quite, like, are not within our reality, but, it works within this world building of this novel. So what I think is interesting about that is that there is this attention in the world of the idea of who will be the killers and who are the final girls. And, this novel is interspersed with conversations on things like Reddit and the idea of our internet culture, which is sort of a meta chorus in a way. So I was curious about when you were approaching this, how did you think about the idea of the meta narrative, I suppose, of final girls in horror movies?
Yeah, well, I mean, where this book comes from in a lot of ways is me looking around and saying, I love horror movies, which means I've spent like 40 years of my life watching people, a lot of them women, get murdered for my viewing pleasure. And I was kind of like, what's wrong with me? What does that mean? Like, what's going on there? All my books have some question I'm trying to answer in them. Often the reader doesn't know what it is. It's something that's sort of got me engaged in there. And that was it for this one. And I wanted to use horror movie. I didn't want it to be too insular, because you get that inside the clubhouse claustrophobia. And so I wanted to make it accessible to everyone. And I feel like at this point in our sort of pop culture evolution, everyone's somewhat familiar with the fairy tales of slasher movies. We all know the summer camp killer. We all know the guy who killed people in their dreams, the prom night killer. Oh, the guy who killed his sister on Halloween. Oh, the Santa Claus killer. Like, we have some passing familiarity with those trends. And so I wanted to make that sort of the baseline. As long as you understood that, you could get the book. And then like there's other stuff in there that's for fun and sort of taking some of those characters. And, I always wondered, there isn't a black final girl. And I always thought, well, that's weird. And I was like, oh, right. Because she would probably, if these were based on real incidents, there probably was a black final girl. They just whitewashed her for the movie. And you think, these are very punishing movies. I mean, these women go through a lot of physical abuse here. They get thrown downstairs and through windows and attacked and slashed and hacked and punched. And I was like, one of them would wind up in a wheelchair. Like, that just is how it would happen. Why hasn't there been a Latina final girl? Like, I just really wanted to sort of like make it feel more like reality feels to me. And then, I mean, if you want to be a total nerd, except for the final girls themselves, like Google any name in the book, like any name in the book. It's a character from a slasher movie. Because horror movie fans love insider stuff like that. And so it was fun to do for me. And it also led me to this sort of weird moment where I was like, you're looking through all these cast lists and credit lists for these movies, and you realize how many victims in horror movies not only sometimes often don't get a last name. It's like John, Josh, Don, Sarah, but a lot of them are ambulance driver, police officer, screaming girl. Like, and you're just kind of like, wow, that's so reflected in our real life, where probably everyone on this call could name 3 serial killers, Ted Bundy, Jeffrey Dahmer, Jack the Ripper. But we probably couldn't name a single one of their victims. And that's a problem. And I mean, me too. I'm not casting like stones in a glass house. But so, and that's one thing I want to do in this book is like talk about and sort of put front and center the people it happens to who survive, not, the killers, the ones who are on lunchboxes like Freddie and Jason.
Well, that, that is interesting, because in the novel, there is this element of, it exists, like this fetishization of like the killers. We see parts of it in the novel, but they're much more they are succinct moments, whereas the story is not about that. It's about the women, the victims. So I do remember last year you mentioned that this originally was a much longer manuscript. That if I'm not mistaken, you said that this was you had honed it down to what it is now. And I was just curious, could you speak a little bit about what some of those extra parts were of the novel? Were they some of these like more meta elements?
No, and in fact, actually, this book, I might have been talking about Southern Book Club. This one stayed roughly similar. I think when I was talking with you last year, it was actually shorter than it is now. So sort of the publication history of this, I checked the file on it recently, and I wrote the first draft of this. The first draft of this is dated like January 9th, 2014. And I wrote this book, and all the big touchstone moments are there. The characters are all there. The touchstone moments are there. And I went to sell it to my editor at Quirk, where I was under contract at the time. And the week I gave it to him to read was the same week that Riley Sager's book, Final Girls, was announced in the trades, and it was coming out with this big press push from Penguin Random House. And so he was just like, I'm not even reading this. I'm not putting out a Final Girl book. I was like, oh, okay. So about 2 years later, I tried again. I did a rewrite, really worked on it. Tried again, and he's like, "No, I feel like it's just played out right now." It's like, all right. So I trunked it, and probably 2018, late 2018, early 2019, my manager who does all my screenplay stuff was like, "Look, man, like books they take too long. Like, do you have anything? I want to sell something. What do you have?" And I was like, "Well, I got this Final Girl books, but no one seems to like it. I like it. I think it's great, but no one wants it." He read it and was like, "There's really something here." And it was 2018. That's when it was. And did a rewrite on it, and we optioned it for television with Annapurna, and that helped us leverage it into actual sale in like December of 2019. And I had rewritten it again since then, and then I always knew what the last 2 paragraphs were going to be, but I always felt like the end was fine. The end was fine. It was like a B minus, solid B. I was like, I don't have a better idea. I'll leave it there. And when I was supposed to be doing copy edits in August of last year, 2020, I was like, oh my God, I realized what this ending has to be. And that actually added probably 10 to 15,000 words to the book. So it actually got longer than when I was talking to you, I think, last year. And that whole final third of the book is new. My editor was like happy to see a better ending, but also a little annoyed because like copy edits, you're really just supposed to be doing sentence by sentence, like small stuff. So it's like now I had to go back to the copy editor, but it was the right ending. So even though it was annoying and frustrating, I couldn't get it published for all these years. It's kind of the right thing to do because I think it took me that long to get the book where it needed to be. So this is a book where there's not a ton on the cutting room floor. Like, there's maybe 1 or 2 set pieces, but not nearly as all my other books. God, there's so much that gets cut out of them. I mean, like Southern Book Club's Guide to Slaying Vampires. There's 2 completely different novels called Southern Book Club's Guide to Slaying Vampire before I got to the one that actually I published. We Sold Our Souls. Oh my God, that book went through like 3 radically different versions before I got to the 4th and final one. So this one weirdly has always been pretty lean and mean, but that's the exception.
Well, that actually brings me to a question I had for you about that is, when you picked it back up in 2018 and were rewriting it, and in fact, adding to the ending of it, did, because the nature of slashers is someone committing crime, like mass murder, did the prevailing amounts of public acts of violence and mass shootings and other forms of attacks, did that weigh in on how you when you looked at this work again?
Well, that's always been a part of it because, everyone thinks of slashers as these cute sort of nostalgia nuggets from the 80s. Oh my God, the synthesizer score and the amazing clothes with the hot pants and the tight t-shirts that say like Space Baby on them. And, the like old Econoline Ford vans and Woody station wagons. They're just like really comforting on that level. The problem is slasher movies are the template for our real life modern American boogeyman story, which is an armed man goes into a supposedly safe place like a school, an office, a house, and he methodically walks through it and murders everyone he sees. And that's always been a part of it. I played that up more as time was going by, like you're saying, as time was going by, I did play that up more, but that's always been a part of it. Cause it's like, what's the difference between Jason walking through Camp Crystal Lake, killing everyone, and, a school shooter walking through a camp and killing everyone? They're very similar. I mean, they're the same to some extent. And so I definitely wanted to try to have that in there. And that's definitely a part of the ending, and definitely became a bigger part of the ending as I was going.
Well, to circle back a little bit, I do think you make a great point about the term Final Girl being a limited one as far as criticism goes. However, it is interesting. It's important because it gives us the language to thus talk about these things and be able to say, well, no, it's not quite this. It's in fact this. So with that in mind, one of the things that I found interesting about your novel is that there is so much attention to the idea of what happens to a final girl after the fact, because there is, I would say, starting with Alien and honestly Aliens, this idea of being a final girl is somehow essentially like step one to becoming, a superhero, a badass. Like once you've beaten one, you can
Right.
do the thing. Which comes into another form of criticism where I've heard it said about, say, the Marvel movies or any of the superhero movies, just that sometimes female superheroes can come off just as men and women's drag, more or less. And
Right.
so I think that's interesting, is that this is clearly a book where you did not want it to be that. I mean, you wanted the characters to be tough in their own ways and uncompromising, but they are still human. They're definitely much more flawed and have their difficulties. Which brings me to my question: is that in your works you are clearly interested in the experience women have to go through in this world. And so I guess what I'm curious about is, how did you think, like, what was going through your mind when you were thinking about tackling this subject and this group of women?
Yeah.
Particularly.
There's two things that were really important for me. One is a big moment where this book comes from is, as a kid, I couldn't watch R-rated movies. I just wasn't allowed. So I used to read about them in magazines or something and pretend I'd seen them. And I bought a copy of Fangoria 12 from April of '81. And it had Friday the 13th Part 2 on the cover. And I convinced myself I'd seen Friday the 13th Part 2 because I read about it. But it was really a whole article on the opening of the movie, because they didn't want to give away the fact that Adrienne King, who plays the final girl in Friday the 13th Part 1 and is in Part 2, gets killed 5 minutes in. And there's a different whole cast for Part 2. And at the beginning of Part 2, I was reading about it. Adrienne's getting over Part 1, it happened, it was terrible. And she's living in this crummy apartment. She's doing some art therapy. She's talking to her mom on the phone, hanging out. And all of a sudden, Jason just pops up and ice picks her in the head and kills her. And I was blown away at the casual cruelty of that. She survived all these terrible things. She's putting her life back together. And this happens? She's never safe? And then the other part of it was, it got me starting to think about these characters outside the movie, right? Well, what was she doing in between 1 and 2? Did she go to therapy? What was going on there? And there's also that great bit in Nightmare on Elm Street 3, Dream Warriors, where Nancy Tompkin, played by Heather Langenkamp, who's the final girl from Part 1, she shows up in Part 3 running a group therapy session for the kids who are being terrorized by Freddy in Part 3. And I was like, whoa. So a character from a horror movie can come help people survive another horror movie. And it just gave me this idea of thinking about these people outside the movie. What was their lives like? What did they do? And Lynette, who's the main character, is really that Sigourney Weaver Ripley character in Aliens. In this book, when it starts, she is, she did what I would do. I always think I would do if I was in a survived a slasher movie. If I was a final boy, I'd totally get weaponized and take self-defense and have guns everywhere and 15 locks on my door and be really safe and not take chances. And really, that just means you're sort of a shut-in agoraphobe with bad social skills. And Lynette's got all these big plans like I would, which is oh, I've got these escape routes and these ways to deal with all this stuff. And it was really, this is the second thing for me, besides that Friday the 13th Part 2 moment, is second thing was, none of it could work. None of it could work. Everything Lynette plans falls apart. Every time she pulls a gun, it does more harm than good. Every time she fights, it fails. She fails. All her plans collapse. And the one thing that saves them all is their friendship, being connected to each other. They save each other. The trust they have in each other over the years, that's what saves them, not being a badass. And I do think there's kind of a, listen, I like to see a cool, I love Aliens. It's a great movie. I like seeing a badass, cool warrior chick as much as the next person, but it can get really tiresome. And you do start to feel like you're just looking at this. I want to see female heroism, not necessarily guy heroism in a wig. Guy heroism always, and I'm not saying these are like reductive to gender. I'm just saying this is the flavors, you know, you see in heroism. Whereas with guys, it's like a lone man standing up for something, and like, you know, he has to fight it, and it's all heroic, and it's big, and it's bold, and just dramatic. And you see instances of female heroism, or the ones I think of as more female, where it's someone who does it every day. They show up, they do the work, they sort of network with other women. You know, my wife's a chef in New York, and when she opened a restaurant, she felt really, really isolated and really sort of on her own. And she'd go to these sort of parties where you'd meet these other chefs and stuff, these industry events, and everyone would be like, you know, oh, how's your place doing? Oh, great, we're doing great. How's your, oh, great, we're doing great. And she started going to these, and she's like, I'm not doing that. Like, she's like, I can't. And so people get, how's it? She'd be like, not good. Like, our numbers are way down. I don't know what's going on. I can't get reviewed. Like, I'm, you know, they just reviewed this dude's restaurant up the street and gave it all this attention. And I've been here longer doing more, and just really started being honest. And the people who were honest back were almost without exception women, other female chefs. And they kind of formed this really tight friend group that has each other's backs in a lot of ways, and they've known each other for years now. And that's in a lot of ways what the group in this is based on, is watching these women in real life and sort of how they help each other, how they turn up, how they like network with each other, how they have each other's backs. It's not as dramatic as this model of like male valor and heroism, but it's a lot more sustaining. And it's a lot less about themselves and a lot more about the group. And I'm not saying only women can have heroism like that, or only men can have it. I'm saying that's sort of the models that you see in a reductive sort of pop culture way. And I see lots of movies celebrating that individual valor. I see fewer celebrating that tougher, harder, networking, showing up, communicating kind of valor.
Mm-hmm. Well, you know, and I think that's interesting, because the inverse I've noticed in your novels, especially with this one, the book club, and We Sold Our Souls, is the opposite side of that. Is there seems to be, as outside forces, you know, that these women must confront, is it's a male force, and it's also one that seems to resent these characters for being
right.
for being, you know, strong. And I guess, you know, is that something that you think about like consciously when you're writing this, or is it just unfortunately something that is systemic of just the nature of the world we live in?
Yeah, well, you know, it's interesting. Like, I didn't set out to set up that dynamic, but it's there, and I find it really interesting. So yes, I wind up thinking about it a lot by default, but I do it because it's there and I see it over and over. I mean, you look at it all the way back to fairy tales, you know, Bluebeard or Little Red Riding Hood, these women who are going up against these much more powerful, much stronger, much more equipped men, you know, and that's that horror story all the way to now. So it's just something you see over and over again, you know, and so I don't see a way not to write about it. If I'm writing about the world I see around me, it seems impossible not to. And it's one of those things that's I think is so all pervasive that it's almost a cliche how all pervasive it is. But it's very weird, you know, it's very, very odd. And you even think about it in terms of, you know, historically, I mean, women weren't individuals with their own kind of, or at least in sort of Western culture, they weren't individuals with equal legal rights until pretty recently, historically speaking. So it's very odd. I find that a really weird part of the world we live in.
Well, looking at what we've discussed so far, what do you think about what Final Girl means, say, in 2021 to...
I mean, to me, it's really like Final Girl is just, it's funny. I think in a weird way, we all kind of wound up becoming Final Girls to some extent last year. I mean, being a Final Girl just to me is like this sort of not quitting, just to keep running. And when I was rewriting the end of Final Girls last year in August, I was down in South Carolina. My mom had gotten sick, and so I had to go down there. And traveling into a hot zone in August during that second wave of the pandemic felt really stupid and really isolating. And, writing that in, I'm like, I'm living in a world where I'm inside. I don't want to be around strangers because they could kill me. A simple trip to a supermarket takes almost military level strategic planning. And all these places that we used to go, schools, gyms, supermarkets, movie theaters, everything we used to do for fun, sporting events, shows, going on vacation, all of it's gone because it's too dangerous. Every camp is Camp Crystal Lake. Every hospital is a hospital in visiting hours. Everything is done. And the only thing outside my locked doors and windows is danger and something that wants to kill me that has a really high body count. And and that's really Lynette's life in this book. And there wasn't anything to fight. There wasn't anything to beat up. It was like the only choice was to keep going and just to keep going and make it. And by the time we all made it and there was light at the end of the tunnel, in I would say like January, February of this year when the vaccines started rolling out, it's like we had all these dead people behind us. It's like in these movies when these Final Girls are running, they're running away from all these bodies and there they all are, all these people we lost. And it's very, very eerily similar. So it made that ending really, it was really, really good for my mental health to be in the middle of that second wave, taking Lynette from this shut-in lockdown place to a healthier place. That helped me a huge amount.
Kind of going off that, have you attempted to write something that is set during, or I wish to say, we can say post-pandemic?
It's not post yet.
I'm hoping for posterity when people watch this.
Yeah. Actually, my next book that's coming out next summer is it's set in the middle of the pandemic, or sort of on the tail end in January. Because one of the things, I lost some people last year, and there were two things that really struck me. One is funerals are weird, and I went to after the sort of in March, I went to two funerals. Neither of which were particularly great funerals. They were both for people who died during the pandemic. And I underestimated how much closure they would provide and how much just missing a funeral with other people, how that just left those threads dangling and it didn't feel complete yet. Your obligation to that person didn't feel done. And then the other part of it is, one thing I see happening quite a bit is this desire to not deal with what happened. This sort of desire to take like January of 2020 and like, I don't know, pick your moment in 2021 and just join them together and snip out everything in between. And I feel like horror writers are the people who are always like, not so fast. Like, let's not get too comfortable here. And so my next book, it's about, adult children who lose their parents during the pandemic, and they're haunted by them because there's never that closure. You know, and in a lot of ways, it's me sort of dealing. You know, my mom had 2 really serious brushes last year. My dad's health is on a steady decline, and you know, we all wind up being orphans. You know what I mean? Like every childhood home eventually becomes a haunted orphanage, whether it's haunted by what you feel like are the spirits of your parents or the memories or whatever that is. Like that's where we all end up. Our childhood home becomes a haunted house. We become orphans. That is how life works. And it's time for me in my life to deal with that. So I'm trying to sort of wrestle my way through it with this book, which also is about evil puppets. So,
well, I mean, I'm already sold. You know, it is interesting because one of the things I was thinking about too while getting ready for this conversation is that with thinking about, I guess, horror movie tropes and how they apply to us is that you know, well, first of all, I'll say is that, you know, I think I mentioned last year, but we've still been in sort of this boom of horror being popular. People like it,
right.
they find it cathartic now, which, you know, makes sense. But I kind of wanted you to ask you a little bit more about some of the allusions you made to fairy tales and this idea of horror being something that deals with archetypes, which is what fairy tales deal with. And is that something that you think about actively? Is this idea of not seeing these as cliches or tropes, but as in fact traditions that
yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Oh yeah, I mean, absolutely. You know, something's only a cliche if you're looking at it and deploying it lazily. Any of these things you dig into, there's so much there. I mean, you know, in sort of classical Greece, and well, I'll give the caveat at the end, but the priest at Orchomenus was the name I use in the book for the email account of the killer. That was they had a ritual once a year where a masked priest would chase women who'd been released into the woods, and any of them he caught, he killed. Now, that's from John Fraser's The Golden Bough, his sort of anthropological study of magic systems and folktales all over the world, written in like the 1910s, which was a very famous book that turned out to mostly be BS. He mostly wrote the book. He never left his study. He just read other books and sort of put them together. So who knows how true that is? But most creation myths start with someone killing someone. Zeus killing his father, Zeus's father killing his father. In Norse mythology, the same thing. Like, and then the corpse becomes the world in Norse mythology, which I think is great. We are the maggots on this giant astral corpse, and murder has been such a big part of human civilization and culture for so long that there's so much there and it's so rich. And, you know, you start looking at our modern day version of it, and I would say the first murder book was from 1888, The Curse Upon Mitre Square, which was the first piece of Jack the Ripper fan fiction that posited that Jack the Ripper was the ghost of a 16th century priest who'd killed his sister, who'd come back to Whitechapel and was haunting it and killing women. And so, you know, and then you go from there to this huge raft of murder ballads. This huge in Germany in the 16th century, some of the earliest popular printed items were these true crime songs. And you get this sheet with like a gory woodcut illustration of this crime, a mom killing her kids, a husband killing his family. And then it would be like the story in verse form with like whatever hymn we were going to sing it to the tune of, so you could sing it with your neighbors. Like, we just love this stuff as people. And it's interesting, you sort of look at Jack the Ripper, and, you know, the last big popular piece of Jack the Ripper fan fiction was Marie Lowndes' The Lodger, which was a story that was Jack the Ripper adjacent, that she published in 1911, 1913, that Alfred Hitchcock turned into 1926's The Lodger, which was a very popular movie about Jack the Ripper. And he kept trying to remake that all his life and could never get the right situation sorted out and the script to his liking. So he wound up making other murder movies like, Psycho, which has a huge impact on what came after it. And you look at the urban legends like The Hook and The Roommate and the Babysitter and The Man Upstairs coming out of the 40s into the 50s, 60s, and 70s. I mean, that's where we get slasher movies from. The story of The Hook is, started in LA in 47 and 48 when the city was being terrorized by this guy known as the Red Light Bandit, who would assault people in like couples in lovers' lanes. He would pretend he was a cop. He had a red light on his car, which is where I got the name. And then he'd sort of sexually assault these kids. And he wound up getting the death penalty. But that's where sort of the first stirrings of the Hook story, and if people don't remember it, the Hook is a story. Two kids, they go to a lover's lane, they're making out, the radio's on. It's like, there is an escaped criminal at large, and he has a hook for a right hand. And the kid's like, oh, let's get out of here. And they drive home, and the guy goes around to open the girl's door, and the hook is hanging in her handle of her door. Like he was just about to open it, and then they took off, and it ripped it off his arm. And the kids are like, we're never gonna make out again. And that is the template for the slasher movie. Teenagers in an isolated location trying to have sex when a nameless, faceless killer with an unusual weapon comes after them, and the moral they take away from it is we're never going to have sex again. Like, it's a slasher movie, and it's like 1947. So, this stuff is just, everything comes from someplace, and I love trying to figure out where it comes from.
Do you think that moral, which has been, a complaint lodged against slashers, is sort of this, and horror in general, is that having a very conservative streak when it comes to gender politics and stuff like that. Do you feel like that was? Is it? You think it's more of a product, or do you think intentional aspects of these storytellings, these like cautionary fables?
Yeah. So the same way that racism is baked into Westerns, like, you're going to have Indians in it. So how racist are you going to be? Like, it's baked into the DNA of the story and so of the genre. And so you've got to deal with it somehow. So, because slashers really do come from either, depending on where you track their source to, either Jack the Ripper fan fiction or these like urban legends like the Babysitter and the Hook and stuff. That really is, Jack the Ripper was killing female prostitutes and not really full time, but that's the story. It's more complicated than that. But these were women who did sex work as part of the way they got through the world. So it's baked into the DNA. You got to deal with it. And in some cases, Black Christmas, they deal with it by, the lead is pregnant, and that's fine. And she's chosen to get an abortion, or her boyfriend doesn't like it. And it's sort of, who's trying to kill her? Could it be him? He has this motive. He's really mad. She's going to do this. Then you have ones like Halloween, which really takes an anti-sex position. Laurie Strode is a virgin, and they talk about that. The kids who have sex get killed. Like, it's very, very, he goes after his sister in the opening cold open after she has sex. Like, it's really right there on the surface. But then you get into stuff like, Nightmare on Elm Street, which is an enormously, it doesn't have that virgin whore dichotomy. I can't remember if Nancy Thompson is a virgin, but definitely kids later in the franchise discover their sexuality and, have babies and do all kinds of stuff without being punished for it. But the Friday movies are enormously sexualized when you compare them to like the Nightmare on Elm Street movies are enormously sexualized when you compare them to the Jason Friday the 13th or the Michael Myers Halloween franchise. Freddy is like reaching up between people's legs. He's got a clawed glove. It's like the definition of a bad touch. He's always like licking people's faces, or he at one point, I think in one of the franchises, he looks like a sexy chick. He erupts out of people's bodies. He grows out of their sides, or their faces are implanted inside. Someone gives birth to him at one point in the franchise. And I think the reason they're so sexualized is he's a pedophile killer. Michael Myers and Jason are not killing children because they're pedophiles. They're killing children just because that's who they kill. But Also because Freddy kills people in their dreams, which is when we're undressed and in bed and asleep. It's really, really intimate. And so it's weird, like the sexuality in that franchise isn't about whether you're a virgin or not, but it comes out in other places.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, look at Slumber Party Massacre, which is a really underrated movie, written by Rita Mae Brown, the famous feminist author who wrote Ruby Fruit Jungle and Oranges Are Not the Only Fruit, and directed by a woman. And it is a movie in which the women in it are sexualized. They're sexual. They have boyfriends. They have sex. They talk about sex. They compare experiences and all this. And the killer's trying to punish them for it, and it's ultimately unsuccessful. So people twist that in all kinds of ways, but it is baked into the DNA. You've got to deal with it.
Is that something? Have you consciously not tackled head on in your own writing? Because that is one thing I have noticed, is that I think it's a good thing. It works in your books because it focuses on your female characters as human beings, as opposed to what could being objectified. But have you thought about writing ones that, I guess, works that deal more with sexuality, kind of in a more explicit way? Because I think it's there in Southern Book Club. It's more it's nuanced in that one.
Right.
It's understood by just the situations. Like you have a scene early on where the protagonist is alone with this strange man in a hotel room. I mean, it's there, but it's not drawn to. So I guess I was curious if you could speak about that.
Yeah, I mean, I consciously avoid it because I've seen it done poorly so many times. And also, like my best friend's exorcism, I'm writing about these teenage girls who are best friends. I'm a middle-aged dude. It is going to be very squicky if I'm writing about teenage girls having sex. That's just creepy right from the get-go. And it's also a facet of everyone's life, and there is a sexual element to the danger. I mean, in Final Girl Support Group, there is this weird frisson underneath everything of this. This is a very sexualized thing. It's these men trying to kill these women in very intimate ways. But I didn't feel the need to make it a bigger deal because, like, I didn't want to get into a whole thing about sexual assault and all that because I can't speak to that in a really genuine way. That's not something I've experienced in a way that I have that inside-out understanding that I feel like it's helpful when an author brings that to the table if they're writing about sexual assault. And in a Southern Book Club, there is a sexual assault. It's the only one I've ever written. I hated writing it. It needed to happen, and for lots of reasons. And I had a really hard time getting my head around it until I realized that I couldn't show it. It was a fine scene when I wrote it, shown, but that was not the way to do it. And so ultimately it's not seen, but it's recounted by the victim what happened. And I felt like that was a way to give her ownership of that. Like, this is what happened to her. This is her experience. This is what was done to her. And this is her talking about it. Like, I mean, ultimately it's me, but like, it needed to be from her point of view, not from my point of view or, the character assaulting her's point of view. But that was tough. I did not enjoy writing that. That was gross. These are my imaginary friends. I lived with them for like a year inside my head, pretending they're real. And it was very unpleasant to do that to one of them. It's something I don't think I'm going to be doing again anytime soon. And, I've got a book I want to write about marriage and relationships, that kind of relationship. I've been married for a ridiculously long time. It's really important to me. But I haven't gotten to that book yet. So not there yet.
So one of the things I've noticed about your works is, so far, your novels have tackled different themes in horror that were familiar. Like you said, you're playing on tradition and archetypes. Is there one or two that you kind of you really want to do but haven't quite figured out how you're going to tackle yet?
Oh, yeah. I mean, there's ones I want to do that I have a pretty good idea how I'm going to tackle. I mean, I'm dying to do a werewolf book. And, to me, the problem with werewolves is they don't make any sense. They're supernatural, which like, okay, sure, but supernatural is weird. You just wiggle your fingers and like, I'm a wolf and now I'm not. And you think, well, you ate someone while you were a wolf, and now you've gone from a 400-pound wolf to a 180-pound person, and you've got like 60 pounds of meat in your gut. Where's that going? Like, where's that going? Like, you know, like where's this mass coming from when you transform into a wolf? How can you switch back and forth? That must be really painful. What's going on with your bones? And I realized that the only way I could write a werewolf book is if it's a disease where you're progressively becoming more and more, well, there's no back and forth. It is a disease progression. And you're slowly sort of losing your humanity and becoming more and more of this like wolf creature and more hungrier and hungrier. That makes sense to me. I get it. I can do that kind of werewolf. But the magic sort of poofy, now I'm a wolf, now I'm a man, now I'm a wolf, now I'm a man. I can't do that. I really wanted to write a zombie book, and I had what I thought was a really good idea. And then someone announced, it was announced in the trades that someone was making a movie along these lines. And I was like, God damn it. So I can never do it. And the movie never came out. They never made it. I don't think it is getting made, but like, it was great. I mean, it was basically, the idea I wanted to use was take zombies back to their roots, that sort of Haitian root. And when zombies were workers in the fields, and you would take some enemy that you hated and zombify them and set them to work in your fields as free labor. And I wanted to do like, that was how, you know, we are having this shortage of migrant labor in America as, you know, we crack down on the border. And it's like, well, where do we get people? Oh, right. We're zombieing it up. The people, you know, they don't need to be paid. They eat, you know, they eat other people, you know, and there you go. But someone was doing that, so I had to stop. But like, I can't think of someone better to work in an Amazon warehouse. They never sleep. They never get tired. They never complain. Throw in a baby like once a day and you're in good shape. So yeah, I mean, it's really, it would have been so much fun to do, but I can't touch that now.
Well, you know, it still seems like it's pretty relevant right now, I would say.
I mean, yeah, this was a few years ago when I gave up on it, and the way like Amazon's so taken over the workforce, it's like maybe I don't know. I'm kind of curious what happened to this movie too. It had a black director attached and was going to really focus on race, and I thought it was such a good idea, but I don't know what happened to it.
Yeah, as you know, things are very fickle in the movie business.
Yeah. Exactly.
You know, and I guess just because I wanted to mention this before we wrap up, that speaking of movies, I think you did something really interesting with Satanic Panic in terms of playing with tropes,
Thanks.
you were playing with the idea of the virginal character.
Oh, right. Yeah.
And, you know, I don't want to give the movie away. In fact, it's a fun movie. You should go check it out, people listening at home. That you, instead of making this something, because it's a horror comedy, so it's been done before in horror comedies that virgins thus are like the butt of the joke. Like,
right,
look at them, they're a loser for being a virgin. Like, who's a virgin?
Right.
It's a really bizarre thing that our culture does for young people. But no, but you gave a reason for why a character was a virgin, and in fact, it's
right,
a complicated, you know, very human reason.
Right.
So I think that was a really interesting way of doing that.
Thanks, I appreciate it. Well, it's also, you know, I love the look of the Satanic Panic in the 70s and 80s, especially. Like the whole idea that there are these underground rooms with these altars draped with naked women and people in red robes with swords and medallions, and they need to sacrifice a virgin at midnight. And I'm always like, where are they getting these virgins? Like, who are they? And so it's like, and I felt like for a young woman to suddenly be like, oh my God, her virginity is this like prize for this group of people. It's just so creepy and so happens in real life. Like, you know, you look at like, purity ceremonies and things like that. And you're just like, ew, why are we talking about a 16-year-old's virginity? Like, why? Like, that's her business. Like, let her do what she wants. So I always find that kind of like fascination with virginity really like disconcerting and weird. And if something's disconcerting and weird, I want to put a tent there and sleep over for a little bit and figure it out.
All right, Grady. Thank you for talking to me today.
Oh, dude. No, thanks. This is fun.
I want to remind everybody out there that Grady's new book, The Final Girls Support Group, this is it right here.
Thank you for being more professional than me and actually having a copy.
Nice looking bloody chair on the cover. You can get this from any of the major retail booksellers. You can get it from your local bookseller if you ask them to order for you. You can also rent it from a library, but support all.
Go libraries.
Well, thank you. So I want to thank everybody for tuning in and for joining everybody here at the HPL Sci-Fi 2021, and hope you have a good time.
Thanks for having me.